And welcome. Welcome to another round of the OAuth Happy Hour. I'm Aaron Parecki, and I'm joined here with Vittorio.
Hello.
It's been a while since we've been here. Lots of interesting stuff has happened in the meantime, so sure we've got a lot to catch up on today.
Yep.
But as always, we'll talk about some of the new things that have happened in the world of OAuth, some of the new specs that are working their way through the standards process. And there's been a couple of recent events as well that we were both attending and participated in. OAuth Security Workshop and a couple of the interim meetings from the OAuth working group. So we will chat about some of the new things that have happened in those sessions as well.
Yeah.
If you are watching live, feel free to ask questions in the chat and we'll see if we can answer some questions as well.
Yep.
Have you not had enough coffee yet today?
I did take a decent amount, but apparently I'm having a hard time metabolizing it. But hey, I'm here. I have big lights, so I'm definitely awake.
Well, fantastic. With that,
So what event should we? I think that the events give us a good backbone for slotting in all the various things. And
Yep.
I have to admit that I've been a bit negligent with interim, and so I didn't follow all of them. But you did attend all of them, right?
I think I did, actually. I think I did. Let's see. Let's go back to the the last time we chatted, which was the last OAuth Happy Hour, would have been October 7th, right?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. 2 months.
Yeah, it's been 2 months. It's a lot. That's a lot. And in the meantime, we've had a handful of other events happening. So that was right after. That's right. I remember chatting about the HTTP signature spec. We had our
Yeah,
stream right after that interim meeting.
I remember. Yeah.
So yeah, since then we've had OAuth 2.1 rich authorization requests, Depop, and token exchange, and then the OAuth Security Workshop. So lots going on there.
Yeah. Although token exchange might be a bit misleading. Let's say that
Yeah.
token exchange is done. It's an RFC and everything. Then there was someone that presented a possible use of that particular of token exchange for that particular scenario, but it was now like my recollection is a bit foggy, but I seem to remember it was very, very, very specific, and that basically no action was taken while working through. Like basically they wanted the feedback, and I think that they also repeated that at the security workshop 1 month
They
later.
did. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, I did not attend that because like after I've seen that here, like, it was interesting, but I don't think it was generalizable. It was like a very specific circumstance and scenario, and yeah, it was an interesting application of a spec, but not something that would become a spec in itself. At least that was the consensus.
That I believe matches my recollection of that as well. I will drop a link to this in the chat though, and in case, see if it's going to show up on the screen. Yeah. In case anybody is curious about the details, there is a recording of the presentation at the from the interim meeting, and I guess there's a recording of the security workshop session as well, because those videos are all online now. So
Yep.
you definitely can go and dig into it if you're curious. But yeah, as far as I remember, the group decided to not do anything directly with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what else? There was your 2.1, like you presented the update on OAuth 2.1.
Yes. Yeah. So OAuth 2.1, we also recorded, and I've embedded the video here. The presentation that I did was mostly like a status update of what's changed since the last time we met. That's how I usually start, and plan changes that are still in progress. Um, a lot of it is from you, so thanks for that.
Are you pointing fingers now?
No pointing fingers, no pointing. It's very, very helpful. But we did have a couple of issues that I wanted to discuss with the group while everybody was there. And these spun out some pretty long discussions. So a couple of these were pretty straightforward. This one, everyone was like, cool, this sounds good. Let's add that paragraph in. It helps clarify things.
Yeah,
So,
and just to expand for the audience, this one was another one that I felt very strongly about. And the point is, OAuth 2.1 omits any reference to the implicit flow. And so as a result, a lot of people looking at OpenID Connect, which does feature one flow that you can technically consider implicit because tokens come from the authorization endpoint as opposed to the token endpoint. Then like people legitimately ask the question, does that mean that those flows defined in OpenID Connect can no longer be used? And the fact is, we already discussed this in a past OAuth happy hour, so I won't go into the details. But the point is, OpenID Connect trades ID tokens, which have a very different usage pattern from access tokens. And also in particular for the particular flow, which is in common use, they are all sent through POST as opposed to URLs. And so this new language, which is in the slide, which is in the non-normative sections of OAuth 2.1, clarifies that the fact that the implicit grant is dropped from, actually is no longer even mentioned in OAuth 2.1, in no way invalidates using that particular flow in OpenID Connect. And my hope is that this little snippet of language, and thank you so much for adding it, is going to facilitate so many conversations with customers, which instead required the entire word salad that I just used now. Instead now, I should just be able to point to this particular fragment in the spec. Done.
Yeah. I think the confusing part about it was the way that I guess it gets talked about is that removing the implicit flow is what's sort of happening, is the way that people are talking about it. But what's actually being removed is response type token, which is OAuth's implicit flow. And response type token, yes, the intent is to make that go away by not including it for any use of response type token. But that has nothing to do with other response types that are defined elsewhere. The big example, of course, being response type ID token, which is an entirely OpenID Connect only thing. It's an extension of OAuth, uses the extension points available in OAuth, and it does those by defining new stuff, defining new security considerations and new protection mechanisms, which is totally reasonable to do. And a lot of people also call that implicit, but those two things are completely different things. And this is hopefully going to clarify that we're not trying to bundle those all together.
Yeah, I think that the challenge in general was in nomenclature to begin with. Like implicit just means token comes, actually not token, artifact comes from the authorization endpoint. And as you say, people used like the only concrete instance of that when OAuth 2.0 first came out was single page apps and response type token, and using fragment for returning it. So those two things co-occurring ended up having using exactly the same name. It's kind of like calling a sneeze and cold the same thing because they come together, but they are not the same. So here we kind of were in the same situation.
And actually, we have a question along these lines. So OpenID Connect on top of OAuth 2.1, a hybrid flow, yes or no? So this is related, and I was kind of curious whether it needs to be put into this paragraph as well, and I decided not to for the first pass at doing this because I feel like it complicates things too much by mentioning all of the different combinations of things in OpenID Connect. However, there isn't a single hybrid mode in OpenID Connect. There are multiple hybrid modes, and there are hybrid modes that include response type ID token as well as response type token. And the intent is to not use any mode that includes response type token. Basically, response type token is no longer part of OAuth 2.1. So that, but that doesn't mean that the other hybrid modes that OpenID Connect uses are bad, because those are not response type token. There's I think I have a slide of this somewhere, but I don't know if I have it fast enough to pull up. But there's response type ID token with code, response type code, which gives you an authorization code and an ID token back in the redirect, and then you can go and exchange that code for an access token, and that's fine because that's using the good authorization code flow from OAuth 2.1, and it's using OpenID Connect's ID token response type, so that's fine. But no, I don't think that there's any reason to use any of the hybrid modes that include response type token, because those all have the same problem that we've been trying to avoid. So,
and because of that, I always discouraged people from ever doing it, even before 2.1 enshrined that. As in, ID token code, I love, because it's a nice, graceful slope of complexity. Like, say that I only want to authenticate, and so I do a response type equal ID token. And I'm happy with that, use it, fine, blah, blah, blah. But then I decided that now I want to start calling APIs. And then if I add code, the flow remains the same. Like, my middleware still accepts an ID token coming from the front channel. I'm only adding on top of it the redemption of the code, and the access token that I get is an access token for a confidential client. So there is ambiguity because I do my request to the token endpoint. So it's neat. I always loved it. And now I'd say it's the only hybrid flow that makes sense at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. As if you only start with response type ID token, then you can just add this response type code in, and nothing else has to change. Like, all your other code stays the same, and then you just added in a little bit of new stuff as well. So.
Yeah, although now I'm going to paint myself in a corner. One classic discussion that happens at that point, which I had many times, and it becomes a matter of opinion, I'm afraid. But say that you have your middleware. Say that your middleware successfully get an ID token, and this ID token is valid. And so allegedly, if you have a response type ID token, you are done. You get the ID token, you validate it, you drop your cookie, and now you have your session. Say that now you add code on top of it. And say that for some reason, the code redemption doesn't work. And so you don't get the access token. So the question is, what should the middleware do? Should it create the session, but then simply not have in cache any access token? Or should it fail the entire thing? And my position is that I prefer that it keeps working, as if I received a valid ID, and before adding code, that was enough for declaring the user signed.
Oops, I think we lost you. Are you still there? Am I still here?
Oh, I'm still here. You disappeared.
Okay, I think we lost you for a second. Let's.
I'm back.
Okay.
Which part did you lost?
You were talking about getting just to the point of getting the code and deciding to whether to consider that user logged in.
Right. So to me, the idea is if the ID token that I received was enough to create a session for my relying party, then it should remain that way because I'm only adding. The only exception to that to me would be if the access token you're getting is for the user info, and at that point, that is integral part of a sign-in semantic. Let's say that if you just authenticated, but I cannot get the attributes I needed, then I cannot say that the sign-in is concluded. So I didn't want to get into a rat hole, but I just wanted to highlight that this stuff is deceivingly simple. But once it comes to implementation, you do need to reason about it. And some of the choices are non-obvious.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Do you think it simplifies things to use only response type code to get both the ID token and access token at the same time then? So that if it fails, it all fails?
It simplifies it in a way I don't like for two reasons. One is that it simplifies thinking about it, but in terms of user experience, it creates more pain. Let's say that if you decided that there was an acceptable situation in which the ID token is enough for signing in, then from the user experience, they get less errors. So it's better. But from the developer experience, I am also a big fan of being able to set up sign in if you don't need to call any APIs. Just sign in the way you were setting up SAML or WS Fed, which allegedly are more complicated, but in this particular case, they aren't. Because if you are doing this flow in which you get the ID token from the front channel, then you don't need a secret. Because you just rely on the fact that the token gets redirected in the correct redirect URI. And you should need the secret only if you want to call an API. And you might want to call an API also for sign-in if you don't want a token to end up in the user agent, which is a valid concern. Or if you want a skeleton token in the user agent and then actually get the attributes through. So it's a valid choice. But unless you are not in that situation, then I try to delay having to use a secret as much as possible, because we know that secrets are problematic. Like you might put them in your Git repo, you might you need to refresh them, to recycle them. If you have like a cluster, every instance of your app needs access to a secret, so you need to. So it can be done if it's needed, but if it's not needed, I wouldn't just do it as for shortcut. Whereas a lot of people in our industry do that because it's simpler. Like if I just give you a sample for the SDK that does just the code, my life is simpler. But I care more about the life of the end user, their quality of life, rather than the other one.
Okay, it makes sense. Okay, let's see what else was in here.
The is was controversial.
It was surprisingly controversial. I thought it was going to be more straightforward. So it's a relatively simple mechanism for preventing a mix-up attack that only exists in certain cases. For example, if a client ever talks to more than one authorization server and uses the same redirect URL for all of them. So
we should tell, I think, to the listeners that there is a draft which describes these particular parameter in IETF for the reasons that you just mentioned. And it exists as its own draft, and it's going through the process at record speed, but it's not RFC yet.
It is going through at record speed, I think partly because it's a pretty simple mechanism that is well scoped to a particular problem. So there's not a lot to talk about. Like, there is a problem in these cases, it is documented, and here's a solution that is pretty straightforward to understand. So that draft does exist, it is going forward, but it's not an RFC yet. So the question was, do we bring this into OAuth 2.1 because it seems to make sense? And the way that we left it after the interim meeting was, no, we're not going to incorporate it yet, but we will revisit the discussion after it becomes an RFC. Because one of the goals of OAuth 2.1 is to just collapse existing specs, not invent new things. So until this exists as a RFC, it doesn't make sense to talk about bringing it into 2.1.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Requiring HTTPS redirect URLs, that one was also pretty straightforward. The OAuth 2.0 was created so long ago that deploying HTTPS was a challenge. It was a big challenge and expensive, often expensive certificates you had to buy. And Let's Encrypt just changed everything. And now it's pretty trivial to deploy HTTPS on your applications, which you should also be doing for many, many other reasons besides using OAuth. So it makes sense to just require it now for all redirect URLs. It used to have this note about the authorization should actually warn the user about the insecure redirect, which I don't think I've ever seen anybody do. But it was one of the recommendations of on the OAuth consent screen, the idea would be you would see a warning that says you're about to get redirected to an insecure location, which seems like a very scary warning to give to users. And I don't know if I ever saw that anywhere.
I haven't, and I think that this points to a more general thing I've observed, which is when we put in the specs indications about experience, very rarely implementations follow the spec. It's mostly like if it's something that it can't be verified in a certification test suite, then people just say, whatever, which includes the consent. Like we have a number of places where we say you have to ask for consent. And then if you look in real systems, there are always circumstances in which the authorization servers skip it. So I'm not surprised that we haven't seen this warning in the wild.
Yeah. But the good news is that the circumstance that required that sentence or made that sentence appear in the original spec doesn't really exist anymore. So it's actually simpler and it no longer will be part of the recommendation.
That's true. That's true. And it's good that for a development time, like if you go hit localhost, although it is really simple, frankly, to add HTTPS also for localhost, and you have to be complete. Like in a spec, in the spec, we can say, you are not strictly forced to use HTTPS for localhost. But if you look at how cookies behave today, if you are not doing HTTPS, then various browsers will interpret the same site property of a cookie as strict, no matter what you specify when you write that cookie. And so in practice, even if we make this exception, the reality of the user agency is that eventually people will have to use HTTPS. And if you have questions on how to do it, like in Node, in .NET and similar, hit us and we can help you to do that. But yeah, and at the spec level, technically, you can omit it if you want to.
Yep, there's another good reason to use HTTPS in development as well, which is there's actually a lot of browser APIs that require it. So things like the location API or I think even the web crypto API requires it. And
I think so too, yeah.
Yeah, there's a handful of these JavaScript APIs in browsers that don't exist on a plain HTTP page. So I've long ago set up HTTPS for my development machines because it's basically required if you're doing any sort of modern development these days. So
yeah, and that's one of the things that I miss, to be honest, of the Microsoft ecosystem. Because when you were in Visual Studio, it was just a checkbox saying use HTTPS, and behind the scenes, every test thing, be it an API, be it a web page, would go through IIS Express, or more recent times they have some other I would say test web server, and it would just do everything in there. Whereas now that I have to use Node because Auth0 is mostly Node, although I can technically use ASP.NET, but when people look at me and say, are you the guy from Microsoft again? So no, here, there's Node. Then basically I use Caddy. Caddy is a super easy reverse proxy. You just make sure that you have a matching ports between your Node app and Caddy. And it does the self-signed certificate on its own. You don't need to do any OpenSSL magic. It's super simple. Just download Caddy, launch Caddy in reverse proxy mode with a port you want, and that's it. Really, really easy.
That does sound a lot easier than what I've been doing, which is I usually install Nginx on my laptop, and it's a full Nginx install, and then I have my own certificate authority that I created ages ago, probably over 10 years ago at this point. And I have that public key up on a web server, and I always download that onto my new machines and make my machines trust my own root authority. And then I go and I have a website that I made 10 years ago where I can be like, hey, please sign the certificate for this domain. And my authority will go and sign it, and I download the cert, plug it into Nginx, and off we go. But yeah, Caddy sounds a lot simpler than that.
Then running your own certificate of authority and moving it on every machine you get.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd say it is simpler. But hey, it's like now you have a complete control. And in terms of security, was have developer machines. So in theory, you shouldn't bank too much. But yeah, having your own certification authority is far stricter than using self-signed certificates. But for me, like at this time, at this point in time, when I code, is just because I'm trying to do a quick proof of concept. I don't really code. So yeah, if I were to maintain my own certification authority, I'd have way more white in all this stuff than I have now.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway. Okay, last one, which is the most complicated one. The last issue that we talked about during the session was there's a handful of things in the spec that were in there because Pixie didn't exist originally that are trying to prevent certain things like authorization code replay or other mix-up attacks and things like that. Things like authorization codes being single use, including the redirect URL when you're going and getting a token, which is like the redirect URL is already done. It's already been used by the time you've got the authorization code. Why do you need to send it again? Well, it's in there for a particular reason. So things like that basically are more or less not needed if you're doing Pixie. And the discussion was whether or not it is a good idea to sort of remove some of these features. And it turns out that there was a pretty strong differences of opinion in a lot of the different points here. So it actually spun out into a whole long mailing list thread as well, which is still ongoing. And my takeaway was that no, we should not try to group all of these together into a single issue, and maybe it's worth addressing them one by one. For example, it was pointed out on a bunch of the discussions that there are other reasons that authorization codes still make sense to be single use, even though some people don't actually enforce that, because some people let authorization codes be reused within a short amount of time in their authorization servers, which is technically not allowed, but people do anyway. And my personal feeling about this one is I would just like to get rid of that one because that's really not needed if you're using Pixie, but it didn't make sense to group these together in the way that I thought it did when I created this slide.
Yeah, this was a difficult one because the thing that you guys are doing with 2.1 is a very brave thing, which is like trying to you are going to touch on things that people just took for granted, like axiomatically. And questioning common wisdom is hard. We tend to try to build on top of it rather than going back to it. So it's these kind of things and visceral reactions like, oh, no, authorization code is single use. How dare you suggest otherwise? Are to be expected. In fact, like a lot of those things were knee-jerk reactions, as in like, no, you need it, rather than bringing the exact scenario that they thought they broke. It was more of like, hey, you are attacking my way of life. But some points were valid. Like I think that the thing about the single use of the authorization code, some major implementations supported using the same code multiple times within a certain interval, simply because there are practicalities behind it. Like if you have network failures, and now you can't actually, like from the authorization server point of view, you already redeemed that code, but from your client, you didn't. Then when you attempt again, then you get the rejection. Allegedly, you have to go back to the front channel and ask the user again, so you get another code. And this was the reaction of some of the old people, not old as in demographically old, but old as in they've been in this space for a long time. The immediate reaction was like, you obtain another code. And say, wait a minute, What about the experience? What about the code you need to write? You are now already running on the backend, and now you need to go back to the front channel. It's like, this is non-trivial. But some of these arguments are really deeply rooted. And so that's why I'm saying that you guys are brave, because questioning that stuff is just going to be more difficult than if this thing would be brand new and you just look at objectively the merit of the argument. Now you also need to fight the inertia of we had these since forever and it works, and so why do you want to mess with it? The redirect URI in the token endpoint is also a tough one, because for that, I remember in the past using these as a way of differentiating between deployments. Let's say that you could have one app that can run in staging or in some special cluster, and then in proper production, or like public cloud and some other cloud. But the entry is the same
client ID, though.
Same client ID, but multiple redirect URI, which you can also some of this stuff could be for multiple reasons. Like you might have a jail in which you want to sandbox some interaction, so you send them to that party, to a different redirect URI because you want to hit the test cluster, something like that. And so providing that thing, like providing the redirect URI to the token endpoint, was part of a larger transaction in which also when you trigger a sign out, and maybe the sign out is from the back channel, specifying the URL is just a way of saying, this is the particular thing I want to sign out from. If you have a multiple deployment of the same app, I acknowledge that this is probably beyond what the specification intended, but at the same time, this logic, like this requirement of like you can rely on that URL to be there, enshrined in the spec for many years, and so you can expect people to have taken dependencies on it beyond the security aspect. So I kind of understand also some of the reluctance, also because it feels a bit like a switcheroo. On one side, you say, we are only going to do in 2.1 what is best practice. And instead, this seems a bit like going a bit farther. It's more like optimization. It's like, now I no longer need to do this because I have this extra measure. And it's not unreasonable, but it's a bit of a different deal than how, at least how I heard 2.1 to be presented. So I understand why there's so much, I won't say animosity, but let's just say passion when discussing those issues.
Yeah, I don't get the sense that any of the discussions have any animosity. That's not the sense that I'm getting with these. I just think there's a lot of different opinions, different perspectives coming at it, and some people have been doing things for a long time, so they want to make sure that those things keep working, which is totally reasonable. But that's why we discuss them. That's why we bring these up.
Yeah, exactly right.
So that was 2.1.
And here I'll say the same thing I said at the interim. I am looking forward and dreading the moment in which 2.1 will come to the native clients discussion. Because I think that in the current formulation, that there is one single set of advice and guidance for both mobile apps and desktop apps. And I think that today, the characteristics of the two environments, both from the security and from the experience perspective, are different enough that they warrant different guidance. And if you try to add one single one, you'll pay a price in terms of usability or convenience and stuff like that. So, but there also, I think that there will be a lot of rooted opinions. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. I hope it will be productive and not, how to say, pitchforks, but we'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. I hope so too. That's basically next on the list for after we resolve any of the current things we just talked about, which seem like a lot of the ways those will get resolved is by not changing things. So
yeah.
Yeah. So then we chatted about rich authorization requests. Were you there for that one?
I was, but I was heavily multitasking.
Mm,
So my recollection is if Brian was presenting, or was it Thorsten?
I think it was Brian. I think it was.
'Cause I'm pretty sure that Brian presented the Depop, but
Oh,
there
you're
are,
right. Yeah.
and I know that Thorsten also presented something, but I don't remember what he presented.
I don't actually remember this meeting now that I'm thinking about it. And the minutes are
Okay,
not loading.
excellent.
I don't know why that is going. That's wonderful. Let's see if this one works. This one works.
All right.
Oh, I took notes. No wonder I don't remember it.
Because you're like they were just a conduit. You're like a,
Exactly.
automatic writing from the spirits. And then, oh, what just happened?
Yeah, totally. When you're taking notes, you just kind of have to channel the words that are flying by and writing them down as fast as possible.
Yeah. And see, it was Thorsten.
It was presented by Torsten. There we go. Oh, Brian is here, and he says it wasn't me.
But does it say with a little song, or like, wasn't me?
Yep. All right. What was the recap of this one? The Oh wow. So we're talking about implementations of it, talking about I guess it wasn't much of an update.
Yeah, it seemed like pretty plain, and then we took a tangent on the usual can we torture scopes to make them do more than
mhm.
they normally would. Oh, Dennis had concerns about privacy. I'm very surprised.
Surprise.
Yeah, I'm being funny. Like for the
Yeah.
listeners, Dennis is a character on the list, and he's like a one issue voter. He cares mostly about privacy, so everything he says is about privacy. That's why I was being funny. Yeah, and I remember because he brings up stuff that is from my spec, the access token profile.
Yeah, that was kind of confusing.
Yeah, in fact, I stayed out of it because Thorsten and Justin handled it.
Yep. Um Now I remember why I 100% remember why I don't remember this conversation was because it was a lot of back and forth. If you look at the notes, a
Yeah.
lot of back and forth I was trying to capture. Um, so, yep.
And some of it was also partly in the chat. Like, I really don't know how note takers manage to stay on top of those events, because like part of it was in the queuing system, part was
Hmm.
in the chat. Also, I'm not a touch typist, which is why I never volunteer to do that. Also, I don't
Okay.
speak English very well, so I don't understand when people speak very fast. Those are my excuses for never taking notes. But you guys are heroes, so thank you for your service, sir.
Yep. Oh, I'm probably due for another one because this was a couple months ago. So get back in that queue for me. Yeah. So then, oops, I lost my tab. Then we had Depop,
Oh, that one was interesting.
and if I remember correctly, that was that was
That
Mike.
Mike presented EPUB? You know what we might be remembering? We might be remembering Brian doing this at the OSW.
Yeah.
He did present on Depop with all his
Oh,
fantastic photos and similar.
I love this in the notes. Brian starts to start the presentation, but Mike shows up just in time.
And start to start is like an acceleration of sorts. It's like, okay. Starting to start, like, where does it end? It's a
I love it.
philosophical.
The Depop discussion has been fascinating because there's a lot of. I feel like it's another one of those where there's a lot of differing opinions and differing amounts of how far people want to go with it, and it's still there's still a lot to untangle. I feel like.
I think that the expectations need to be set. Otherwise, we'll just keep iterating. And there is a lot at stake behind Depop. Like, to me, one of the most urgent reasons to have a Depop finalized is a FAPI 2. Like, FAPI 1, like the financial service API, is predicated on MTLS. Like, it doesn't just say, I need sender constraint, I need MTLS. And MTLS is an interesting beast because given that it talks about the pipe, if you operate a service at hyperscale, like a lot of us do, you might be using things like Cloudflare and similar. So the way in which we implement these has important infrastructural implications. And so in FAPI 2, the language is more generic. It's like use sender constraint, but let's look at each other in the face. Right now, sender constraint is MTLS and maybe tomorrow Depop. Depop is the only other contender because we know that token binding died an undignified death when Chrome abandoned it. So I should be more careful with my language because if I know that some people are still processing the grief of that happening, but like that's what happened. But anyway, the point is I think that it would be super useful to have Depop, at least a subset of it, finalized. But the challenge is that Depop is different things to different people. On one side, there's the crowd that says, I want to use Depop for everything, not just for single page apps. The other is like seeing confusion with credentialed clients or like actually having more stable credentials. Other people are more interested in terms of performance for hyperscaling, which using asymmetric stuff as we do today might not give them the level of performance that they need. So I think it would be useful for us as a community to put some stakes in the ground and say, okay, those are all interesting problems. The problem that we are pursuing with this version of the spec is, and once you agree on that, then we can resume the technical discussion. Because right now, it looks like on the surface, we are discussing technical merits, but in reality, my impression is there are different worldviews in fight. It's not just a matter of the technical stuff. And discussing those two levels at the same time is super hard. So my suggestion to the stewards of the spec would be clarify scope, and then we can try to close this thing. Otherwise, we'll just keep... I cannot say being idle because there is a lot of work. Like this is one of the most exciting things in our space. But I really do hope that we can find in ourselves to deliver something so we can implement it.
I agree. And I think that was one of the pieces of the presentation at the interim that I was seeing a lot of confusion about, which was I was seeing a lot of discussion about like particular solutions or applying it in a certain way without providing the context for it. So I felt like that was the missing part, was like, okay, we understand you want to use it for this, but like, what exactly is the problem that you are facing that is causing you to want to do that? And I felt like those problems weren't getting expressed well enough. So that was one of the pieces of feedback that they did take away, and then came back onto the mailing list and did some more discussions there and provided that context. And I think that's been very helpful, because if the group has 5 different problem scenarios that everyone is thinking about differently, and then we all go and want particular aspects in the spec without agreeing on the problem space, that's what causes the mess. So if we can all get on the same page about like, here are the problems we care about, these are the ones we think we can solve with this, then it should be a much easier discussion to actually solve those.
Yeah. 400% agree.
400. Cool. Okay, Depop. We talked about token exchange.
We did.
So then the security workshop was a little bit later. That was just 2 weeks ago, in fact.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Beginning of the month. At virtual coordinates 00.
Very Cartesian.
And so this event, for people who don't know, actually, hold on. Before we get to this, there was a question that I just remembered I saw that I wanted to mention before we move on to the security workshop, which is this one. Is there any way to join the OAuth working group meetups as a listener? Yeah, you can join the OAuth working group meetups as a listener.
Isn't there
or
an
as a
IPR?
Yeah, so you have to, like, there isn't a special listener mode. You can just join it. So there's no like membership process or anything, but if you are interested in joining, you can absolutely join. You do have to agree to the terms of participating in the IETF working group, which is pretty straightforward. And yeah, you can definitely tune in. The interim meetings are held, I think, usually in WebEx, and then the recordings get put up later on YouTube with the rest of the IETF meetings. But anybody is welcome to join. There's no.
So now I might be confused with the OpenID Foundation, which is a different animal. But I know that apart from special events in which explicitly it said no need to sign an IPR, like the ITF has this like note well, which includes something that you are agreeing upon, and there might be a document to sign, like if something that you might have to do with DocuSign in order to participate. So I don't recall if it applies to ITF or not.
That is not the IETF. I'm trying to find the link now.
Let's see.
I'm trying to find the link for it. It is. I think it's in this working groups page. Information about participating in the IETF. This is the page. So
or maybe there's like you can read, but if you want to send mail, then you need to have. There might be some of those aspects.
The thing is, there's no formal. Yeah, it even says it here. The IETF has no formal membership, no membership fee, and nothing to sign. By participating, you do accept the IETF's rules, including the rules about intellectual property.
Very nice.
It is very accessible.
Fantastic. Then it's really OpenID, which you needed to do the IPR. In fact, like
that sounds.
I had an IPR for Connect, and then I started recently contributing to FastFed, and I had to go and sign another document to extend my IPR scope. But apparently ITF is more relaxed.
W3C is even worse. There's even more hoops to go through if you're going to participate in those. So
even for the community group, I had to sign something, which I remember because, like, of course, before signing anything at all, I sent to legal, and it's an adventure. Every time you speak with attorneys, like, of course, they mean well and they want to protect you, but it's kind of like it's different than working with engineers. It's just a completely different plane of existence.
So yes, this is the link for how to participate. It's essentially you just show up. That's the short version. And if you're curious about when the meetings are, I've been putting them on this events.oauth.net, which is the unofficial document, place of OAuth events. I put the IETF meetings as well as related community events on here as well.
It's incredibly useful. Like that page is fantastic.
I feel like it's a lot more a lot more accessible than some of the other IETF pages.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And also, I can hear you include everything, including things like IIW, right?
Yeah. We don't. I need to add that now that it's got the date and registration's open. But the past events, like you can see we've got Identiverse. When there's like a major conference that's relevant, I'll put it on here as well. The Federation of Browsers Workshop, which is the W3C group that you've been involved with, so I've been putting on here as well.
Very nice.
And I was putting our happy hours on here, but I haven't been lately because I feel like it's borderline whether it makes sense for going on here. Anyway, that is a great place. And if you do want to add it to your calendar, there's a feed at the bottom. Just subscribe to that in Google or Apple Calendar or whatever you want, your phone even. And you'll just get the events on your device, which is great. So the IETF meetings, those are the like official ones where there are, minutes on the record, official decisions, all that kind of stuff. And you do have to agree to the IETF's IPR rules and stuff by participating. It's very informal, but that is technically the official. Totally separately is this OAuth Security Workshop, which is not part of the IETF. It is not official in any way. It is a community organized event that invites people from the OAuth community as well as others. And
Mostly others.
It's mostly others. And no, there's a handful of OAuth people that
always
come.
So the thing is with the ITF is first, it's the weirdest conference you'll ever go to. But the main thing is if you are interested mostly in one working group, then the main advantage is networking. Like in the same space, you'll find a lot of experts that care about the same things you care. And so you can have a lot of good networking discussion, move things forward. It's very meaningful. But in terms of structured moments, those are ridiculously small. Like you travel all the way to this city, and then you have something like 2 hours. And your presentation is something like 20 minutes. I remember the first time I did in person, I got the mic to present my spec and have some high bandwidth conversation. And all my time was lost because someone said, I didn't read the spec, but, and made a question which we already covered in the mailing list. And the entire 20 minutes of high bandwidth were gone. It was like, But luckily at dinner in front of a beer, I had the various discussions that I needed to have. Do you know if the next ITF is going to be in person?
If I remember correctly, it is virtual. No, now it keeps going back and forth. Now I can't remember the current state of it. It was going to be in Bangkok, and then that got canceled. But I think it's still going to be in person, but they don't know where yet. But now it's getting to be pretty close. It's only 3 months away, so I'm wondering if it's back to virtual.
IAW is in person, but Omicron. So who knows if it will actually happen. I hope so, because I am so tired. I'm so done with Zoom. And after having tasted Identiverse and the European Identity Summit and Authenticate in Seattle, virtual stuff. Like I loved the OSW, but virtual stuff is got really old. Let's face it.
Yeah, the OAuth Security Workshop has been an in-person event up until the last year, and it was virtual this time 2 weeks ago, and it was a great event. I thought it was well run. The sessions there were a lot of useful sessions. It was pretty dense, a lot of good discussions in all of them, but it's still a virtual event, and it is still very tiring being on Zoom for 8 hours 2 days in a row.
Yeah,
and you don't get the snack breaks in between to chat with people. So
there is no serendipity. It's all structured time. And I guess that we'll talk about the content next time, given that we now have only 3 minutes.
I guess we are out of time. So we'll have to chat about some of the interesting sessions there later. But the workshop, it was 2 days, full schedule both days. Lots of great sessions. You can see the timetable here. It's mostly time zone conversions is what the space is used for, because people were joining from everywhere. But it was really good. A lot of good sessions, a lot of good notes coming out of those. All the videos from those are online as well now. So if you are curious about any of these topics, you can go back and watch those as well.
And I think it's going to be worth to do commentary, even like I guess that the next time we'll do the happy hour will probably be January. But my suggestion is we should pick it up where we are leaving it today, because like some of the ideas there were actually pretty new. So I think it's worth having a high bandwidth conversation about it.
Yep, I think it's a great idea. So yeah, if anybody wants to do a little bit of reading through the notes and come with any questions, that's great too. We can kind of have a discussion that way. So yeah, sounds good. That'll be a good place to pick up after next week.
Wonderful. So
next week. I don't know why I said next week. Who knows? It'll be sometime in January.
Yeah.
Next month.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining live, and drop questions in the comments later if you have any other questions. We're always watching the comments on here. So with that, I guess we will say goodbye for now, and make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you can get notified when we do have the next one. We post them on YouTube. Otherwise, you can also find the schedule of upcoming events at oktadev.events. That's our calendar for the workshops that I run, the OAuth workshops that I run, as well as conferences that our teams are speaking at, and these happy hours get posted there. So lots of good places to find us again later. All right.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you all, and
thank you.
Happy holidays.
Bye.